Thousands of families were separated at the border. They're supposed to be back together by now, but that's not the case. Where do things stand for court-ordered reunification? San Diego needs new homes, but a lot of vacant, unincorporated land is off limits. How developers are getting around the rules. And California's declining birth rate. Young couples say they're putting off parenthood due to the soaring cost of living. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, Jean Guerrero, who covers immigration for KPBS, John Sepulvedo, morning host of the California Report on KQED in San Francisco, KPBS North County reporter Allison St. John, and KPBS investigative reporter Amitha Sharma. Well, the Trump administration continues the onerous task of reunifying immigrant families that separated at the border. Reported this week that most have been reunited, but the entire situation remains fraught and complicated. So, Jean, start with the news this week on reunification. Thursday was the big deadline.
Right, so the government says that it met the deadline, that more than 1,800 families were reunified. However, it's very unclear, given the numbers, what's really going on, because there's hundreds of people who are still unaccounted for. Many of the people who were deemed ineligible for reunification, we don't quite know what criteria the government used in all of those cases. And I think the most troubling thing is that more than 400 of the parents that were separated from their children are no longer in the United States, and the government really doesn't know where they are. And so reunifying those families is going to be a huge challenge, and there are currently nonprofits looking for these people in Central America, but many of them are in Mexico trying to make their way back to the United States to recover their children, so they could be anywhere.
So it's still a very fluid situation. The judge is having another hearing today. The news is going to continue on this story. John, many families from countries in Central America have been released, usually with ankle monitors pending their asylum claims. Others remain in detention facilities. Why the difference there?
Well, a lot of it depends on what their case was, where they were brought in. A lot of it's the individual agents who are dealing with them when their intake process happens. A lot of this reunification is also happening in Texas. It's not actually happening here in California. To Jean's point, KQED went to Guatemala last week, and we found really startling evidence. One case where a young boy who is separated from their parent started to believe he had a mental break. He's 6 years old, and he started to believe he was a dog because he was kept in what he considered to be like dog-like conditions. We heard of other parents who were told that if they signed a piece of paper, they would be reunified with their kids, and ended up being deported and flown to Guatemala City. So there is a lot of questions, to Jean's point, not just about why these deportations happened in the first place, but then how the government's going to do that. And on a call yesterday, the spokesman for ICE essentially said, once somebody goes into another country, we don't keep contact, we don't keep track, and it is going to be up to nonprofits and other people who are going to act on these children and these parents' behalf. So to tie that into the question you asked me, it really is a case-by-case basis, not just for who gets out, who stays, who ends up in detention, who doesn't, but also whether these reunifications happen. It's really, really dependent on the personnel on the ground.
And the advocates and lawyers working with the families and all, they say, to get to your point about the effects of this, that the trauma has been stark in some of these instances. Right?
And Jean can speak to this as well, obviously, but this case where a young boy believed, had this mental break, this is an extreme case. But overall, we are seeing psychologists in Guatemala say they are receiving children who are having incredible mental and emotional breakdowns that they did not have before. And these are kids who are coming from areas with 90% poverty rates, employment around the same, unemployment around the same, lack of clean water,
often
under the
fleeing
threat.
Violence.
And this is what's breaking them, according to these psychologists. So there is something to be said about the toll this policy is taking on the people who are affected by it.
Amitha?
So several hundred, or I believe 700, more than 700 kids remain in custody. The U.S. government has missed deadlines on reunification. Are there any penalties? Is there a price to pay for not meeting these deadlines?
So The court can technically hold the government in contempt of court, but it doesn't look, given the tone of the proceedings, it doesn't look like the judge is going to do that. Currently, it seems like they're just going to be pressing for more transparency, more information from the government. If they don't meet these deadlines, they need to explain why.
Jean's absolutely right. And just to add to your point, the judge, Judge Dana Sabra, has a real...
That's here in San Diego.
Yes, has a real tight path to walk, because his goal, and he's made it really clear, is the reunification. And so anything he does that could potentially punish the government or that could rankle the government's feathers could set forth the grounds for appeal, and that will delay everything. So you could tell that that's really on his mind this far as the proceedings have gone.
And his reaction overall was he's pleased with the progress so far. But another hearing today, who knows what they'll say.
Yeah,
I mean, what do you mean by pleased?
Yeah.
He has pointed out it's deeply troubling and very upsetting that there's, well, he calls it unpleasant, an unpleasant reality, that there's so many people unaccounted for.
Right. So I guess, go ahead, Alison.
Well, we've heard this number 2,500, ever since this sort of began, but isn't the problem actually a lot larger than that? I mean, aren't there other kids that have been separated over the years that, under different circumstances? I mean, what I wonder is, where do these kids go? I mean, has the government been just letting them go into the community foster care? I mean, why would they take responsibility for children? That's not the government's bailiwick.
Right. I mean, it's just once these families are reunified, there's this idea that finally, like, there's this happy ending, that the struggle is over.
What everybody wants.
But it's completely the opposite. The attorneys have been talking about all the traumas that the families have been dealing with. They're having trouble getting basic information out of these families because of the fact that just questioning them makes them start crying, and the mere thought of being separated from their children again is so frightening to these people.
Jean is, again, 1,000% right. There are about 10,000 kids who are in ORR custody who don't meet this class definition. But let's talk also about the parents. Many of the parents feel broken. They felt like they couldn't, they entered illegally. They are seeking asylum. These aren't people who are crossing in the middle of the night, as some people have suggested. All of them, some of course have. But my point is that many of these parents feel so humiliated at the end of it. I spoke to one parent from Los Angeles who was deported back to Guatemala. Again, this is an extreme story, but he asked to use the restroom. It was a bowel movement. ICE would not uncuff him so that he can take care of the business that one has to do after making such a movement, and instead made him sit in his own fecal matter. This is the allegation according to him. These are heavy allegations, but they are consistent, and the idea is to essentially, what's being taken away by the parents is that there's been a great loss of dignity and agency, not just because of the disconnect with their children, but because of the conditions that they are held in while they're in detention.
The search for the parents who've yet to be unified with their kids, what special tools are available for these nonprofits to find them, given that they're on a journey, and then some of them come from really remote areas?
Well, just very briefly, I was in Huehuetenango, which is in north of Guatemala, and I did not see the nonprofits. What I saw were private attorneys. These were private civil attorneys who sent investigators to these areas to try and locate parents, because they're looking at class action suits, financial suits. So, and they've sent doctors and things like that. Now, as far as and they have had much better success than the nonprofits I'm aware of. I don't know if Jean has heard something different.
No, last time I spoke to one of the attorneys at a nonprofit, they mentioned that they'd only been able to find about a dozen of these parents. And the problem is that they need the information from the government, and the government hasn't provided complete information as to who it deported and to where.
So this will go on for some time. We got a little time left in this segment, and Jean, this story's been relentless for immigration reporters. You folks have been really busy. You've also been juggling the release of your book, Crux of Cross-Border Memoirs. Is there overlap between the two?
Right, so it's about my quest to understand my father, who for a time I didn't know where he was. So I guess part of the overlap is simply that I, as a journalist, as well as from my own personal experience, am very familiar with the traumas associated with not knowing what happened to a parent, not knowing where a parent is during childhood. And so I've been looking at several families who are dealing with these traumas after reunification, and the ACLU has been pushing for the judge to order some kind of mental health services, for the government to provide mental health services for these families. But currently these families have no services available to them to deal with children who in some cases were kept in facilities that have since been closed for abuses ranging from inappropriate sexual contact with children to harsh punishment. And these mothers and fathers don't know how to help their children.
And as we've said before, the government is always a lousy parent, and no matter what the situation in this country.
As someone who is in foster care, I can say that sometimes the government does do the right thing. But to Jean's point, I read Jean's book. It's excellent. Everyone go buy the book right now. But more to it, it's really, to me, I read it as something that was about a person looking for identity, but also the identity of being a father and the identity of being a mother in Jean's book. And what we're seeing in this particular case is that the very core identity of fathers, mothers, children are being stripped from them. And the fallout of that is not something that we can sum up nicely for a roundtable segment here.
No, and there will be plenty more reporting.
And said that there's no worse failing as a parent than failing to protect your child,
Right,
which is exactly what these people
All
are
right,
doing.
and we'll leave it there, and there's going to be a lot more reporting on this as we go forward. A big story here and across the southern United States, the entire country, actually. Well, we're going to move on. Tension between San Diego County's housing crisis and the need for smart long-term planning came into sharp relief this week. County supervisors may toss aside years of hard, costly debate and planning in favor of fast-tracking 10,000 new homes. So, Allison, start with some of the context here. Now, what do the supervisors control, and what is the general plan for people who may not be familiar with it?
Right. Basically, San Diego is growing. It's undeniable. There are more people being born, and most of that growth is coming from our own children, incidentally, not from outside. And so the question is, where do you put the new houses? And we all know about how the housing situation is desperate. So the pressure is on to find where to build. And really what's been happening this week with the county starting this process of approving mass developments, very large developments that will add hundreds of homes in North County and thousands of homes down in Otay Mesa, is they're saying, we're going to just have to give up the planning that we spent years and years doing with masses of input from the community and millions of dollars spent. And the developers have come up with these master plan communities, and we're just going to have to approve them. So the whole idea of developing more in the urban areas where you've got the infrastructure and avoiding sprawl, is sort of disappearing under this pressure to build more houses.
And
so what kind of homes are we talking about? What kind of homes? How affordable are they?
Well, this is the thing. None of these homes are what you would call affordable. They are probably, I have seen some that are down as low as $400,000, but most of them are $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 homes. They are single-family homes, and the developers are saying, look, the next generation want to raise their families in single-family homes just like they did. They don't want to be living in urban apartments.
Allison, in my neck of the woods right now, we are seeing the Reading fire, the Carr fire, just devastate an area. Unfortunately, I covered the North Bay fires that were the deadliest fire in California history, recorded history. What is being done in this plan to ensure that these sprawled out homes are going to be properly mitigated for wildfire?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, where are they?
That urban interface.
Right.
Well, the ones that were being talked about this week are up just south of 76 and west of 15, sort of in the corner west of Escondido. They're in the hills by an area that's close to Elfin Forest, which is a beautiful reserve.
And a name we've heard a lot in fire coverage in recent
years. That's right. So that was what a lot of the testimony was about, was people who live there who are like, we've seen so many fires in this area. Many people have horses. The roads are not that big. Even though the developers will expand the roads, the number of people, 2,000 to 3,000 more people who would be trying to get out in the case of a wildfire, it doesn't look good. So what the fire department said was, and they basically gave their blessing to this project and said, we think it's okay, is that when we had the 2007 wildfires, we evacuated 500,000 people in San Diego. You may remember that. And the freeways were clogged. We are not going to do that. We are going to be much more surgical. We are going to advise people where it's safe to remain in place. There'll be a lot more sheltering in place in the case of a wildfire, that the homes are more designed for wildfires, which was surprising to me because I haven't actually heard this kind of fairly radical shift in policy from, be ready to evacuate when we tell you, to well, you know, there's going to have to be some people who shelter in place because the roads will just not take the number of people that will need to move.
Yeah, that is a big difference. The reverse 911, get out. Some people resist that, but I mean, when in doubt, they get people out early.
I think we need to talk a lot more about this. If this is going to be the argument for why we can build more houses in these places where the infrastructure hasn't really been designed to meet that amount of growth.
Briefly, in Reading, we're seeing, you know, my colleagues have reported really clearly that there are traffic jams. We saw people who did not leave because they in the North Bay fires, because they looked out and they saw that it was a mess and thought, oh, I'll be okay. I'm really, and especially I heard one eyewitness describe the Reading fire this week as a fire tornado, that essentially the fire just exploded. The corridor that you're talking about in that corner of Escondido is very similar geographically.
That kind of area, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So for both of those reasons, the fact that the years of planning are disappearing, that none of these houses are going to be affordable, and that it really does raise concerns about, you know, the growing risk of wildfire to our urban interface.
And we mentioned at the outset the developers are working to get around the rules because the general plan says, you know, these are restricted areas. How are they doing that?
Well, basically they're granting waivers, and they're saying the general plan is not cast in stone. It has to rise to meet the occasion, and it's true, we do need more housing. But the question is, the community had said you can build housing, but build it over here, not here. And now, instead of building where the community has said that they were willing to accept more housing and that the regional planners have built more roads, the developers are going for the bigger, emptier lots where there isn't a lot of infrastructure and the land is cheaper because it's not zoned for housing, and saying, here, we can provide you hundreds of homes over here. We know it's not according to your plan, but, you know, the land was cheap and, you know, the fire department is signing off on it. So I think it's a question in many people's minds. I know a couple of the supervisors have asked, why are developers not building in the areas where our community said you could build? Some developers are, but they're smaller developments, and I think perhaps the profits are less big. And maybe there are not a lot of the smaller developers that you need to take up these infill projects. So the developers who have the most resources and want the biggest profits, they want these larger areas that were not zoned for development.
Now, a big part of that general plan was, as you said, we're trying to cut down on sprawl, which goes to driving and pollution and climate. We do have a bite here from the spokeswoman of the San Diego Climate Action Campaign. Set that up for us.
Yes, so Nicole Capretz, who of course is a hero in this region for setting climate action goals.
And she's defending the general plan.
She is defending the general plan and is very concerned about the way it's being dismissed.
Let's hear that.
For anyone to suggest that the general plan is a bad plan is denying 10 years of diligence and thoughtful consideration that went into designing and developing the plan. And there was consensus amongst all the stakeholders that we were creating the housing that we needed and that we were creating the transportation infrastructure that we needed.
All right, about out of time in this segment.
Yep.
What's the timetable? We're going to have a series of hearings on whether these waivers will be granted, right?
There's 2 more hearings coming up and another 5,000 homes that would be built or could be built if, in fact, they grant these waivers just in the next 3 months.
Okay, a lot of follow-up on that, and we'll be talking about that in the summer to come here. Well, what does it say about the California dream if couples postpone having kids because they can't afford them? The nation's birth rate is dropping, and it's dropping even faster in California. And Meetha, start there. What are the current birth rate numbers? They're really low.
Well, I'm going to give you 2 sets of numbers. One set is from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and that agency came out with numbers that basically said that California's birth rate is the lowest it's been since the Great Depression. It is at 11.9 babies per 1,000 people. It was at 13.1 babies per 1,000 people back in the Great Depression. Just to give you a little bit of context, it was at 21 babies per 1,000 people just as recently as 1990. The California Department of Finance does a different calculation. They say that right now we're at 1.76 babies per woman, and that it hasn't been this low since the mid-1970s when baby boomer girls and women were going to high school, going to college, and getting into the workforce, and then delaying giving birth for a few years. So the birth rate dipped a little bit in the mid-1970s, but then it shot back up.
And below the replacement value, right?
Right, but it shot back up in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the replacement level is at 2.1. So right now we are below the replacement level.
Okay, so this raises all sorts of questions. The basic one is, of course, why?
Well, I should say that across the United States, the birth rate is also dropping. It's at 1.82 children per woman right now. As I said, in California, it's at 1.76. And the difference between the rest of the country and California is, big surprise, housing.
Just what we were talking about.
The cost of housing. The National Bureau of Economics did a study back in 2016 and estimated that for every $10,000 increase in home prices, the fertility rate dropped 2.4%. And what's kind of interesting is, and that was for non-homeowners, but among homeowners, the fertility rate actually shot up 0.8%. So there seems to be a connection, but I think there are other factors. So the overall argument is that, you know, society is asking a heck of a lot of people who are between the ages of 25 and 35. You graduate from college, you've got to build a career, you have to help pay down astronomical loans, student loans, have to find a mate, you have to buy a house with a huge mortgage and high property taxes. And a lot of people are saying, well, okay, I'm not having kids on top of that, or I'm not going to have kids until I feel settled into this financial stuff. So a lot of times this is too late for people to conceive. And then some people are saying, well, if I have a kid, I'm only having one.
What's the ballpark cost on having a child if you're born today and to raise a kid?
So the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, estimates that it's a little bit over $233,000 per kid between 0 to 18. That doesn't include college.
$250,000?
Yeah. A quarter of it. So, but in California, it's actually $250,000. But some people, I spoke to one financial planner, and he said it's probably actually way more in certain parts of the state.
Well, that's a nice segue into a soundbite we have. You interviewed a professor of urban planning and demography at the University of Southern California, Dal Myers. Let's hear a bit of that interview on what this means.
Those kids aren't really all for you. Those kids are important for all of us, because those are our future taxpayers and workers and home buyers. And if you don't have those kids, I mean, who's going to buy my house? Who's going to pay the taxes to support me in my old age?
Yeah, who's going to cover Social Security and Medicare and everything else?
If immigration is cut off. Yeah.
Well, and I wanted to raise that issue.
Let's
it comes
talk about immigration.
right back to immigration.
So immigration is really an interesting component in this discussion, because a quarter of the babies born in this country have at least one parent as an immigrant. So you take away that one parent, and we might have a quarter fewer babies, but in the state of California, 50% of the babies being born have at least one parent as an immigrant. So immigrants have been a big help in terms of keeping the birth rates up.
I'm just curious because, you know, in Western Europe and places actually where the housing is subsidized, we're still seeing a decline. That there is the no doubt the economic correlation. But there's also an educational correlation.
There is a strong correlation.
And so I'm kind of curious, are we making a bigger deal out of this than it is, just because this could potentially indicate that California has reached a mature level of society? And also, is there one of the things in these Western European countries, they'll do things like have specials, like they'll give free vacations to couples who go out and essentially conceive a baby. You know, they'll call them kid vacations or whatever. They've done all these kinds of incentives to try and promote people having romantic relations. So I'm wondering if anything like that is going on.
My answer will be a bit of a two-parter.
Okay, good.
So the demographer whom you just heard, Dal Myers, he says, from an economic point of view, we need those kids. I mean, we need the tax base, and we should be doing everything we can to boost the birth rate. However, if we're not going to do that, then we need to maximize the value from the kids that we have already. Like, we need to get twice what we're getting out of them right now. We need to get twice as much. And the way to do that is to ensure that we're helping them get through college, and that we're even helping them get graduate degrees, because studies show the more education you have, the higher paying job you're going to get, and the more tax dollars you're going to pay. So if we're going to keep the birth rates low, then we need to have super educated, super successful people as our tax base. The other part of it is a real valid point. I mean, studies studies do show that the more educated a woman is, the fewer kids she's likely to have. I mean, California, according to this demographer, he says, was relying on immigrants, especially Latino women, to make up the difference. Back in 1970, they were having 5.8 kids per woman. Now, their numbers have also dropped to 2. So it's slightly above the rest.
Second generation.
But you know, birth rates have gone down with Black people, with Asian people, white people, and Latino women. So the belief is that education is the reason.
All right, well, fascinating discussion. I'm sorry we're out of time, but all sorts of good things to follow up on in the coming weeks. And that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Jean Guerrero of KPBS News, John Sepulveda of the California Report, Allison St. John, and Amitha Sharma, also of KPBS News. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for being with us today, and please join us again next week on the Roundtable.